Welcome everyone to Art Lounge Alley. This is Figure Drawing Basics Part 78, climbing up there. I am your host, and I am going to start the stream right away. Alright, so picking up from yesterday, I'm just going to continue working on this image right here. So these past few days, the focus really was on shading, understanding the light source, the direction that the light is coming from, and how that affects the face. And I've given you guys examples just showing how really most of it is fundamental. Like, no matter what the shape of the face is, the way it's going to, the way the light is going to hit the face and the way that the shadows are going to form from it is pretty much, it applies to all sorts of faces, all sorts of features. Just to give you guys a quick example of that. Uh-oh. Getting some light actually from there you go. But now the stream has frozen. Okay. So yeah, as you guys can see for this face, the light is coming directly from the right side, and the left side is in shadow. And the shadows are pretty exaggerated here. They're very dark, as you see it on here as well. So despite it having different features, obviously, than this face, the ways the shadows form and how the light hits the face is pretty much similar. So you could see how, for instance, down below here, how the light travels only so far until it starts to curve away from the light, and you can't see anything on this side of the face. The same thing for over here. As you see right underneath the nose, there's shadow that's forming as well. And obviously the sockets aren't getting much shadow either, much light in them either. And well, it's kind of difficult to show, but underneath the chin, it would be the same case as well. And then once you start changing the light source, for example here, as you can see, the light source is coming from the top down. So in this example here, you could see it's a little bit more exaggerated. Just in this diagram, it's more exaggerated to just give you guys an idea of where the light source is. Obviously, on the actual face itself, the gradations are much more slight. So from the top down, you could see that the bridge of the nose and the nose itself is getting a lot of the highlights. There's going to be shadows forming underneath the nose, as you see here, and around the face. So you could see that right by the cheekbone. Underneath the cheekbone, it's the same scenario here, that light doesn't really hit this area since it's turning away from it. It's forming a shadow on both sides. And then of course underneath the chin right here, since there's an edge kind of defining the jawline, and also the thickness of the jawline, and that edge tends to curve inwards more, so shadows would start to form more, and you guys would be able to see better if there was actually a neck on this head. But just to give you an understanding of how this really is, like, all these examples don't just apply to this face, don't just apply to these face features. It applies to all the faces. And you guys can experiment with this too. I highly encourage you to dive into working with clay in order to construct a face like this, because then you can use it however you'd like. If if you have a light source, if you have a swivel lamp, you could actually just change the light source and study the head and how light and shadow form on it, as opposed to, let's say, working from a photo, which is a still image. There's not much room for maneuvering the head or changing the light source or anything like that. You're kind of stuck with whatever the image has. Whereas with this, if you take the time, not only do you have a modeled head for you to be able to just maneuver and change in direction, perspective, draw the face in all sorts of angles, but you also gain a really good understanding of the face. You know, you're going to study and you're going to spend time forming the face and understanding how certain things really do have to jot out, how certain things have to recede in order for the face to actually look realistic, in order for it to resemble a human face. You know, starting from like the skeletal structure, you know, the skull itself, and then layering on, I guess, the muscles and the skin part of it, so that you could get a better understanding of like, yeah, this should be protruding out because this is the jaw, this is the cheekbone line of the skeleton, of the skull. And then how it follows, you know, why does it follow in that same curvature going towards the ears, you know, and then the indentation underneath that, the cheekbone, like what is that really, what is that area? Because you understand those things, you end up never really overlooking them or taking shortcuts or just drawing based off of memory. You know, I remember when I drew a face, this is the line, and I put the line here. But if you understand like the entire structure, why things are the way that they are, it gives you a better visual understanding in your mind's eye, and that allows you to create all sorts of faces. You know, you don't have to only draw just one type of face. You could draw many different faces because you understand these principles. You understand like, okay, you know, you need to do this, this, and this in order for it to look right. You know, regardless of the kind of face features that I'm going to have. And then from there, you could play around with things like you can make the lips thinner, you can make the bottom lip thicker or thinner if you wanted to. You could change the length and height and width of the nose as well. So like that all becomes just whatever your imagination wants to create. But prior to it, just understanding that foundation of it, it really gives you that solid ground to work from. All right, so just going to continue on with this. A quick overview of this as well when it comes to drawing, especially when it comes to this phase when you are shading. You know, you are trying to create the shadows, to create the highlights. Just remember that nothing on the face is ever as white as the paper. That's kind of why you see this like light coat that I did on this drawing. And I'm going to continue to work with that while darkening shadows. And that way, the skin actually starts to look light in comparison to all the shadows that have been formed around it. And you guys will see it's just something that kind of happens, you know, after you start putting in all that detail. And I'm doing it layer by layer. You know, I'm starting out, when I started out, it was much, much lighter than this. And the reason for it is because it allows me time to adjust as I go. You know, so as I'm creating these shadows, I could be like, okay, it needs to be a little bit darker or it needs to be a little bit lighter. And it's not too late for me to change that in that process. Whereas if I right away jumped into creating really dark shadows, for instance, underneath the eyes, if something else didn't turn out right, you know, maybe I made it a little too dark, or certain areas underneath the eye are a little bit too dark, then I wouldn't be able to go back. You know, it's already in there. It's all ingrained on the paper. It's really dark. And for those of you who know, of course, from practicing, from drawing, once you press really hard on the paper, it's difficult to erase that line. So yeah, the gradual process is just really important. And it's very tempting for people to just be like, oh, I know, this is where the shadows are, and then just like really fill it in and kind of just speed up the process for yourself. But it ends up you end up shooting yourself in the foot in the long run. Gonna have to move it down a little bit. I noticed that you guys can't really see the full image. And I really want to render this out. You know, I don't want to skip over this because it is an opportunity to improve, you know, being able to shade and of course gaining more control over the pencil. You know, that's the benefit of actually taking the time to do this process. As not only are you studying the figure, not only are you studying, or rather the face features, not only are you studying shadow and light, shadows and light forms on the face, you're also gaining better control over the pencil. You're gaining better control over the lines that you're making. So all of that comes into play as well. And that's kind of one of the reasons why I want to go along with this and keep practicing, keep drawing and developing this, rather than just skipping over to the next diagram. And it is a soothing process because really at this stage, you've already established the proportions. You've already understood the face. You know, okay, I like how it turned out here. And it's just, you're just beautifying the image, really. You're making sure everything is blended in well. The parameters are set. You don't have to worry about that anymore. So that's why it turns into more of like a soothing thing. You're not really stressing out about all these other things. For those of you who are learning shading for the very first time, I think it's important to really pay attention to the line that distinguishes between midtones and shadows. So the transition from, let's say, here to here, and you could see that it's this line right here. But if you take the time and really blend that in, you'll see your drawing improving a lot more, and there's going to be more dimension to the drawing itself. So in this section right here is the perfect opportunity to compare and see, okay, how much darker is this supposed to be than any other point on the face? Should it be as light as it is here, or is it darker, or is it lighter than this? So you have plenty of areas on the face to kind of gauge it. You don't want to just kind of wing it or not really pay attention to that relationship, between this area and other areas, because it might be out of sync. For example, you might make it extremely dark when it doesn't call for it in this angle or in this light source. So yeah, I'm working off of a reference, and just kind of got in the zone again of shading this. And when I say it was soothing, I really meant it. I kind of like get so sucked into the process that kind of can't tell that time is passing. But yeah, just based off of the reference, this area, and it also just makes sense, despite what I was saying earlier, you really don't want to avoid a comparison, but just in better understanding, because basically the chin area, the jawline, is jutting out, it's going to cast a shadow. It's going to obstruct any light from reaching underneath it, and it's going to absorb the light for itself in a way. And it's something that I was talking about before. Like, if you think about the light source, it's really like a beam, right? Like, light source is a beam. It's not like water. If you pour water over something, it'll take the shape of whatever object you pour it onto. And light doesn't work that way. It's more of like a beam. So anything that obstructs its direction catches a lot of the light, catches a lot of the highlight. and anything that is being blocked away from it obviously is going to form shadows. So it just makes sense that underneath the jawline, it's going to be darker than other areas on a face as well. So in this example, you see it as directly above, right? It seems like everything is kind of having equal amounts of shade and highlight, but here it's showing something a little bit different, which, you know, you guys can take a look at it and take a guess, you know, where exactly is the light source coming from? I'm going to say, based off of the shadows, that it's slightly to the left. So even though it is coming from above down onto the face, the light source is slightly towards the left side, and that's why a lot of the shadows are forming on here. And that's an important detail to pay attention to and think about, because something I mentioned yesterday as well is a lot of times beginners who don't really understand light source, they draw based off of what they remember, you know, and something I mentioned earlier, like where they're like, okay, I remember I drew this face and this is where shadows were. And then they draw another face, let's say a face from their imagination, and then they just put the shadow there as well because it worked for the drawing that they were copying or referencing at the time, rather than really understanding the light source and seeing like, okay, if it's from the top left, then which areas are going to be in shadow? It's not going to be the right side of the nose or the bridge of the nose that's going to get a lot of shadows. It's going to be the left side. But in this case, it's a lot lighter of a shadow because it is coming from above and it's on the face. It's not behind, like behind the hairline or anything. It's above and it's more directly on the face. So as it travels down, of course, as I mentioned, it's going to hit the bridge of the nose more. And parts of it is going to just like fan out, right? So it's like coming down here, and you guys could see it here as well. It goes down the bridge of the nose, or this area right here, also catches a lot of the light. And then this light kind of disperses to the sides as well. So it might not get as much, obviously, because this part is the most protruding part of the nose, right? It's like the peak of the nose, so you're going to see a lot of highlight there. It's getting the most sunlight there, whereas everything else is kind of getting what's left of it, you know, to the sides, on the cheekbones as well. So that's kind of what you're seeing here. That's why you're not seeing really dark shadows on this bridge, on the bridge of the nose and on the side over here. So now, even though I filled in, the eye more, the inside of the eye, it still seems a lot lighter, right? Because of everything else. Because I've darkened all the other areas on the face, that area starts to seem a little bit brighter. And that was kind of the idea of like gradually working around everywhere, darkening up areas and then moving on to the shade prior to it and darkening that up, et cetera, until the highlight sections really pop out. I'm not going to spend way too much time on the hair. There are little creases and crevices on the hair that, if given enough attention, bring more realism to the drawing. I want to just mainly stick to working on areas where there's a lot of light source information, rather than really trying to like render an incredibly realistic drawing. There's a couple of more examples when it comes to the light source. I'm still thinking about whether I should upload this to Patreon. I think it would be pretty good for just examples of light source for you guys to be able to study. Maybe it might be a little bit too intimidating for those who are beginners, but of course I always encourage you guys to try and push yourselves to that level as much as and as often as possible. But I think, just in terms of observation, studying where the light sources hit, as I mentioned, the way they hit the face is pretty common amongst all types of face features. So you do benefit from studying this, despite maybe not drawing exactly the same kind of face or the same sort of features. Is just getting a general idea of light source. So look out for that. I should be uploading them pretty soon after I finish these. I think that would be pretty helpful. There was something I actually realized these past few days as I've been developing the next special stream. There was an artist that I was looking at his work, and it made me realize that, yeah, pen work, when people draw using the pen, is actually a beneficial tool. Like, some people would say, well, why use a pen? Why not use just like a brush pen? The black ink in the brush pen, it's a lot darker, it's richer. And the answer to that is that you can't get as much variation in gradation when it comes to that. Like, that's why people do feathering, right? You see like old school comics, and they do the feathering technique where certain areas are just getting these strokes as a form of like shading. But with pen, first of all, it's permanent, right? It's more permanent than pencil, but it allows you to actually get all sorts of gradations. And this artist particularly worked with pens. So that's another medium to venture into. Like, that's something cool to do when you are, let's say, in class and you're kind of bored or whatever, and you got a pen there, you can use it. Come up with pretty cool drawings. It's a lot darker than a pencil, but it's not as dark as a brush pen, and it shades just like a pencil would. You could, depending on how hard you press on it, you get different results. So it's so obvious, but before I used to think like it's not a drawing medium, right? It's like something you would use for writing. I never really thought of it much as actually being used for that purpose. But yeah, it's like a middle ground between a pencil and a brush pen, and like black ink. You're getting the best of both worlds, kind of. You're getting darker lines, but you're also allowed to create shadows and shading and all that stuff, and you could vary your thick and thinness and the darkness of the lines that you make. So, and I'm pretty excited about showing you guys this upcoming special stream. I think it's going to be a really long one. I might have to actually break it down into like 4 special streams. Really depends on how much time I'm going to be giving to each artist to each stream, because I'm sure despite creating all this information, I'm actually going to take the time to talk about each and every one and highlight like what's interesting about each one and get into that, and hopefully get you guys involved in chat as well, talking about all these different artists and their work, and the history, generally the history of all of it, which is very interesting. And that's probably the biggest reason why it's taken me a while. It's because it really does have a lot of impact. Like, all these artists have such a huge impact in terms of illustration and like the time and place, really, like that era and kind of style that people had when it came to like the kind of clothes that they were wearing and the subject matter, and what was appropriate, what was deemed appropriate at the time, and what wasn't. I think we've really come a long way in comparison to those times, and I think a lot of people now who are much younger don't see that. They don't understand the reality of that time. I mean, they kind of are, considering how ridiculous politics has been for the past few years, even, the form of restrictions and oppression and all that stuff. But still, in media, you still don't have the same level of oppression as, at least in the States, as it had back then, back in the early 1900s, 1800s, that time era. Things were just like, ankles are viewed, you could see the ankles of this person, or, there's slight suggestion there. It's like way too sexually overt. that's so controversial. Whereas now you like open up Instagram and there's like softcore porn basically on there. And you know, there are no real limits or anything like that. So, you know, for people who are of this modern generation, it's almost like outlandish to think that there were restrictions and that people really did have to watch what they were putting out on as an art form, as an exhibition or whatever else. You know, now it's just like all those things that were considered to be provocative are just completely saturated in the media now. So it's just kind of an interesting time warp. You know, you get into these artists, you read about it, you read about that history, that period, and it's like, man, what a huge difference. Like, good thing we don't live in that time era. But I think there's still some really beneficial things to take away from it, you know, or to vary things in a way, like especially in like how sexuality is presented, and you know, what like titillates the attention. You know, sometimes overt like sexuality isn't the most sexually appealing. I won't get way too into it because I do want to save that conversation to when I actually have examples. I could talk about it more in comparison and show you guys like what I'm talking about exactly here. But just to, I guess it's like a bit of a teaser for something that's coming. Should be fun. So I'm taking time to darken up the lip area because, again, I'm comparing to say, like, okay, how much darker is this area supposed to be in comparison to the shadow that's right above it? And I noticed that the lips were a lot lighter when it calls for them to be as dark, if not slightly darker, than the shadow right underneath the nose. Remember, you want to get everything to be connected with one another as opposed to sectioning things out and being like, okay, I'm just going to work on here. I'm going to make this dark. I'm going to work on here and make it this dark. You know, then you're going to have like multiple levels of darkness that don't really make much sense depending on the light source. You know, you want to stick to the light source, and you also want to stick to understanding the relationship between all the different parts of the face according to that light source. And at this stage, I'm not really shy about like pressing harder because I am satisfied with the proportions. I am satisfied with the size of shadows and just the likeness, I guess, in terms of like the reference. So the reference really does resemble the reference. So at this point, I can really start forming the shadows more. And as I darken those areas that are in shadow, it gives me more room to actually play around with other areas as well. Because again, I could say, well, how dark should this area be in comparison to the shadows? Like, how dark should the shadows underneath the nose be in comparison to the shadows? Just kind of work off of that and continue to build from there. Same thing with like the hair, which is really like another area that calls for attention, but as I mentioned, I don't really want to get too into it because they're very fine, minute details that are going to spend a lot of time. I mean, at this point, unfortunately, I do have to end the stream in a few minutes for the week, actually, until Monday, where you guys can catch more drawing basics, bigger drawing basics, and I'll be back to doing drawing comics, so you guys can see me do more work on John Buscema's Conan the Barbarian. It's moving along. The goal is, for those of you who are just tuning in for the very first time, is to draw the entire comic book from start to finish. Every single panel, every single detail, as much as possible. As much as possible before moving on to the next. It's just being in the habit of drawing comics. If you guys haven't seen the very first episode, I talk about John Buscema, and I mention that he was always drawing, and that he actually produced 2 issues per month. So on average, issues are about 28 pages, 30 pages. So that's like 60 pages per month that he was developing. So that's really impressive. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that, again, he was always drawing. And I also quote his brother, who says that he would eat, sleep, and breathe drawing. Every time people looked over, he was drawing something. So it paid off. You know, he's able to actually produce that many issues per month. So it's kind of the goal here as well, is to develop in that direction. Now, granted, he did work with inkers, so that kind of cut the work in half. Whereas if you guys have been tuning in, you saw that pretty much every single panel I've inked and colored as well. And that's one of the reasons why it's taking this long, is because, you know, back then the process was divided. It would be pencil work, and the pencil work was pretty much finalized to the extent of just needing the person to like ink over it. You know, it wasn't in rough draft form. It was actually pretty finished. They just needed to make those lines darker. But then it would be sent over to the printing factory for it to be able to, for them to color it. So, you know, having to do all three of those things is really what's taking so long. Yeah, I should be done with this this comic book already, but because of all those things, and you know, I'm actually glad I'm doing it, because as I mentioned, like, I really enjoy the process. I like the mediums. I like learning all these different tools. Like, I like learning how to use the brush pen, and I like learning how to use watercolors. That's a cool process. They all have their own experience, you know, and they have their own uniqueness to them and during that experience. So, you know, I'm not really complaining about that. But it is a good point to acknowledge. As opposed to attributing it to being slower than expected. Well, that pretty much does it for figure drawing basics, y'all. I'm gonna clip the strip here, the stream, not the strip. I'm gonna clip the stream here. I'm gonna take a 5-minute break, and I will be back for the project stream. For those of you who are new, it's gonna be something that I'm working on from my imagination. It's a character that I'm developing, and I'm gonna be working in Clip Studio Paint. So you guys are gonna see the digital process of all that. And that's coming up next in 5 minutes. So if you guys do enjoy this content, remember to hit the like and subscribe button. They both help the stream and are greatly appreciated. All right, y'all. Just a little bit more detail here. I'm gonna call it the end of the stream. Okay, maybe just a little bit more underneath the chin. I feel like it's getting a little too much highlight. I don't want to give her like a chin strap with dark shadows. Okay, before I get more into it and I start noticing other details, I'm gonna end the stream here. Everybody, I will see you in 5.